Welcome to Perspectives. Jim Luttrull is a local government official you may never want to see in action because that means you'd be watching him work in a courtroom. For nearly 15 years, he's been the prosecuting attorney for Grant County, and before that, his career in the criminal justice system has shown him many dimensions of our Grant County community. Today, he still considers himself what he calls a shepherd of justice and a service of the law. And so we welcome Jim Luttrull. I pulled those quotes out from some questions we asked you in advance, and when you talk about being a servant of the law, let's just start right there, Jim. Okay. What does that mean to you?
Well, it means that we're not. First off, I'm not a partisan. I'm a public official. I'm a political official, and I run, and I'm glad to run with my political party. But as soon as I'm elected, I'm now no longer a Republican. I do not approach my job in a partisan way. But I serve the law, and so I don't serve any particular group in the community, but my staff and I, we serve the law and we serve our community in doing so.
I'm going to pursue that a little bit further, and then we'll kind of pick up on your background, how you got there from there. But I've seen you in action, as many of our viewers have, in the courtroom. Maybe they've unfortunately needed to be in a courtroom, or they've observed. And I guess my observation, as having been a journalist myself, is sometimes you have to live with the worst in our society. How do you reconcile that with this idea of being a servant of the law? Because that sounds so positive, and yet you deal with so many negatives.
You do deal with negatives. Today's been a downer of a day with a couple of difficult cases that have been presented to us. And yet, in the midst of those, you also are very close to and get to witness up close and personal acts of courage, of bravery, of people desiring justice. In some cases, people seeking forgiveness. There's many of basic human our human experience that's played out that's not always all negative. Sometimes it's very positive, the things we get to see. It's down to brass tacks. It's where the rubber meets the road in terms of the law and our community. But people would be surprised that there's also positives there. Because of the negatives, I certainly lean on my faith, my church, my family, things to balance out some of the ugliness that we have to deal with. I also try to remember to encourage and pray for my friends who actually see the ugliness a little closer than I do. Those police officers, child protection workers, emergency responders who are right in the midst of it, and I'm more peering over their shoulder watching some of this negative, bad stuff in our community. So I'm very thankful for those brave souls who even see it more closely than I do.
When you speak in court, you speak for the people of the state of Indiana or the people of the state of the county of Grant. Mm-hmm. I don't know exactly the language that's used, but we've all seen it in courtroom dramas. But I think it's really something when you are in there personally and you say, the people rest, or the people. Right. What does that mean to you, the people?
Well, you know, and my colleagues in California or state of Illinois would actually be called the people's representative, and we truly are in the same way. Technically, our title is the state of Indiana, so a judge will ask, is the state ready? And after 35 years of doing this, if what I tell my staff, if your knees still don't tremble a little bit when you rise to the court and say, yes, the state of Indiana calls as its first witness, if you're not humbled by that, then maybe you need to find a different line of work. So I find it a terrific and tremendous privilege to be able to speak on behalf of the community and the state, and humbled by it still after all these years.
35 years of doing it, certainly you know it's not perfect. The law is not It's a living organism, but you still, I gather, have a sense of hope that, you know, the system, broken though it may be in ways, still does good, still ultimately is worth investing in. Is that a right assessment of your philosophy?
Well, I think so. Otherwise, I would have backed out many, many years ago. It's not perfect, and we rarely, if ever, get it exactly right in terms of how justice is determined. We, however, have an important function to play, and we do a lot of things right, and it's important that someone stand up on behalf of victims, on behalf of the legal system, and in fairness, with due process in mind, and with justice as our goal. We speak up and hold people to account for crimes that they've done against a specific person or against our community.
You ever look back now, let's get to the biography, we'll get back to philosophy, but you ever look back and say, how did the kid of academic dad and kind of growing up near a college, how did you end up in the law? Let's go back to that childhood coming up. Okay. One of five?
One of five, four sisters, myself. So my sisters would all say with some degree of truthfulness that I was the spoiled one in the family.
I was going to say, is that where you got your argumentation skills? I don't know.
I certainly, I was the quiet child who was under the radar, but I listened to a lot of very good arguments going on between my sisters and my folks. My mom is she always claimed to be 5 feet tall, but I'm not sure she ever made it quite to 5 feet. But she was a person of passion and fire and believing and standing up for the underdog. She grew up very poor in a coal mining town in Western Kentucky, and so I think she had a sense of the underdog needs to be protected, and but also a very strong belief in right and wrong. And my father, to whatever degree I have an objective, calm, able to examine impartially a situation, I get that from my dad. So these two contrasts of these wonderful people, I think that helped me. You know, I was back in the mid-60s. We had Horseman and Martin Booth School up on the hill there on 3rd and 4th Street between State Road 18, and I was a traffic crossing guard as a 4th grader. So that was my first role in public safety. And maybe the power of that job got to me.
Enforcing right and wrong.
That's right.
Crossing the road.
I tell you, you're 10 years old and you drop this cane pole with a red flag and a semi-truck stops because you did that.
That's pretty powerful.
It is.
What brought you to Marion?
My father was a assistant principal. He was in administration public schools in northern Indiana, and Maurice Burns was the academic dean and asked him to come and be dean of students, and back in 1964. So we moved to this community, and except for a year in California and a few years in Indianapolis, this has been home ever since.
Adopted home, but really I think that's long enough to say it has been home. It's probably the only place you ever knew. It
pretty much is. You know, there are some people here in Marion that think if your grandparents weren't born here, you're not from here, but I consider it home. Our boys consider it home, and we're all very grateful for the experience. It was a great childhood, growing up for the most part in the shadow of Marion College then, but being a part of the community, the greater community as well, and it's been a privilege to be able to work and worship and raise a family in this town.
Dramatic changes, obviously, in the college, probably more of them even in the out years after you were an alum. But what have you seen in the community that you think has shaped you as far as the changes? I'm sure in the 60s, probably a larger population, certainly larger larger enrollment at Marion High School when you went through there, Marion Community Schools, and then you've seen some of those cycles. What other changes you think drew you or shaped you in this community?
Yes, I think my high school class was, I don't know, 750 or something. My sister's a couple of years later, a few years later, was maybe the largest class. And then we've seen a drop since then. I appreciate the community, the neighborliness that I grew up around, and the people of different walks of life, blue collar, white collar, black and white. We certainly seem to, from my perspective, mix better then than we do now, unfortunately. And I learned a lot from my friends and from their parents growing up here, and of course being a Marion Giant fan shaped my life in the certainly certain glory days of Marion Giant athletics, and just the community itself. I remember when the opportunity came back to leave Marion County Prosecutor's Office and come work in Grant County, I started regretting some of those claims I had said that I'll never move back to town, move back home. I was so glad to do it. So there were many experiences, both here and on campus, when it was a smaller campus growing up, and then in the community with athletics and the great teachers that I had at Marion, McCullough and Marion High School. Those all helped shape me.
Okay, well, we want to pick that up from college days forward. When we come back, we do need to take a quick break, so we'll come back from perspectives, more from perspectives with Jim Luttrull. And so we see the glamorous life of the law. Back now with Jim Luttrull. It's a lot of preparing for what happens in the courtroom, isn't it? A lot of still legal work. You've got to love, as a lawyer, the life of the mind a little bit, don't you?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit of God's joke on me, I think, given my grades in high school and college biology and chemistry, and then now I have books on my shelf about child head trauma and DNA and other aspects of science and forensics that I have to bone up on and learn. And I tell the laboratory analysts that I get to work with, just use small words and speak slowly for me. And maybe that helps me communicate with jurors. But it is a lifelong learning process, which I think takes some of the burnout factor away if you approach it that way, that I'm always trying to get better at my craft and understand some part of, whether it's forensics or the law or something better.
I think people watching, as we all do, courtrooms on television and movies, they don't realize, but they should, their first year of law school, just how much they're going to be in the library, how much they're going to be preparing and writing briefs and all that. For you, coming through then Marion College, when did it click in your head that maybe I should go to law school? Was that somewhere in the years of college?
The truthful answer, the candid answer.
That's what we want.
Okay. I'm sitting over at Baldwin Center at supper time, speaking to a young co-ed that I'm interested in. And I said something to her about, I'm thinking about being a teacher or maybe going to law school. And she said, oh. And it was that oh that, now her name's Debbie Luttrull.
I was going to say, is it Debbie?
Debbie Campbell said, oh, and it's the way she said, oh, that made me even think more seriously about it.
I was going to say, if it was going to be a life-changing response, I hope that's the one you married.
It
set a trajectory for you.
That is. So I actually went off to law school. I started at Pepperdine in Southern California, and went onto that campus never having met a lawyer, other than I had a brief conversation once with Tony Maidenberg, who was our mayor at the time. And Tony's an attorney, but we didn't talk about law, and he probably doesn't even remember that conversation, but I'd never met a lawyer, and it felt like every other classmate of mine, you know, was going to go back to grandfather's law firm when they got out of school, and I felt like a fish out of water, but it turned out to be, law school wasn't the greatest experience, but the law, particularly the prosecuting career, has been very rewarding.
I want to come back to that, but you got married senior year or around senior year
right
at
before
Marion College, and you let us know about sort of a significant event in your marriage early on. Tell us as briefly as you can about Debbie's diagnosis and how that shaped kind of your response to your early marriage, but also the community.
We shortly, it was in April, we gotten married in August, right before the senior year started. In April, I was busy being a student teacher. Probably not the best student teacher Madison Grant's ever had, but doing my best. And Debbie was finishing her last semester, and she came down with a strange illness or symptoms. We were very worried about her becoming unable to walk and move her arms, and we went into the hospital a couple of times. One of our local physicians spotted it right away as Guillaume Beret syndrome, which was most likely triggered by a combination of having the flu and having the swine flu vaccine a few weeks before, and it was 77, 76, it was very common. Anyway, she spent about 8 weeks in the hospital, 9 weeks in the hospital. 7 of those weeks was on a respirator, completely paralyzed, unable to speak, and not knowing what our future was going to be. The hospital bill grew to enormous amounts, and yet we saw community, our church and our community, the campus, but many people just from around town that we didn't know came to our aid and supported us, and it really had quite an impact, of course, of our faith, trusting God through the experience. And Debbie certainly grew out of that. Fortunately, by the time when we went off to law school, she had regained some of her walking ability by August of that summer, and has mostly a full recovery, and we've had a wonderful, wonderful life. This August will be 40 years of marriage, and at the time she was ill, doctors were worried that she may never be able to have children, and we have 3 grown sons. And
yeah, a little side note, poetic justice here, maybe in the fullest sense of the word. 3 sons that are in some form of the arts.
In the arts, not the law.
Not the law, not the analytical. I know that comes largely from Debbie, but also you have great love of the arts. It's just not your chosen line of work.
Right.
What I'm hearing is somehow those kinds of things, plus you already grew up here, really created a bond with this community that maybe drove you to seek public service, because obviously you have options as a holder of a law degree, and once you pass the bar, and you did some private practice, but how did that end up with you choosing more of the public route?
Well, I was starting my 3rd year of law school in Marion County in Indiana University, Indianapolis campus, and got an internship at the Marion County Prosecutor's Office. Steve Goldsmith at the time was the prosecutor, and I was one of 7 interns that started that year. Walked in and saw my first jury trial ever, and was just smitten by the drama, by the tension in the air. Was surprised by how dramatic it all seemed to me. Immediately, I remember the thought was, this is not television, this is real, and surprised by how much I was drawn to it. Then as I did that job and then came back here to Grant County to work as a deputy prosecutor, I remember one of my first trials was an elderly woman whose home had been invaded and she'd been robbed, and the wedding ring taken off of her finger. And I remember trying that case, and that wedding ring was had been pawned within 30 minutes of the robbery, so it was a significant piece of evidence. And prosecuting that case, handing her in court her wedding ring and seeing her take it and slip it on her finger, even though it was a piece of evidence that she was not to leave with, but she left that courtroom with that exhibit on her finger. No one had the nerve to ask it back for her. That dramatic experience and gaining a conviction in a case that many thought was fairly weak, I guess just cemented perhaps the idea that maybe this is what I'm wired to do. This is what I was meant to be.
And you call yourself a storyteller. I found that interesting. And truly, you do have to, it may not be resolved in 60 minutes like a television show, but you do have to tell a story. You do have to weave a narrative into a courtroom. Is that something you found came naturally for you?
I don't know if it came naturally, but the working at it was fun. I wasn't necessarily very good at it, but I enjoyed getting better at it. And you know, I was privileged to have had Marge Elder as my advisor and one of my main profs while I was here, and I think she and some other key teachers at Marion High School helped inspire the love of story in me. And you know, we've learned from a variety of great teachers, and Jesus himself was an example of how you can communicate truths through story. And taking individual stories and when they intersect with the law and with a crime, and thinking of interesting ways to tell a true story that will hold people's attention and cause them to want to do the right thing. That's just a challenge. So I don't know that I'm natural at it. I don't think I am, but the working at it was something that I enjoyed.
And when you have to tell a story, first of all, I would imagine you have to be convinced. So if a case comes to you, you have to be convinced right is on your side. Then is it easy, hard to go in there and sell the truth, if you want to use that term? I don't mean that in a flippant way, but does then that compel you to say, okay, we're going to get justice here?
I think it makes it easier. If you have to become convinced yourself that given all the reason you have and all the work that you can do to examine all the evidence that you have seized upon and figured out what happened, and then thinking of a way to tell it and to hopefully convince 12 people on a jury to do the right thing, and the judge to do the right thing, and to see the case in the way that you believe, and working with police and others that is the truth. It doesn't come easy, but it's something that's can be very rewarding, sometimes very stressful, and sometimes you're frustrated that you weren't, maybe you didn't do a good enough job to put it together.
Well, it sounds like it is a challenge that will shape you for a long, long time. It's interesting to hear how you got there.
Oh.
Thanks for sharing your story, Jim, and thanks for opening up a life that people may only see as an official, and we now know a little more about the person behind it.
Well, thank you very much.
Perspectives is about the stories of Grant County and Central Indiana people, and if you know someone you'd like us to meet, email us at wiwtv@nwest.edu or send us a note, WIWTV, 4201 South Washington Street, Marion, Indiana 46953. I'm Randall King. Thank you for joining us.